Uh, Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Dean Quinteri, Professor Bagela, Professor Giovanni, Ambassador Saha, Ambassador Fabian, Ms. Moriarty, and my friend Umberto, who is responsible, who is the cause of my being here for this morning. And it's a great pleasure, great honor to be here at the University of Tor Vergata, because wonderful place, and I've never been to an Italian university before. And having been a professor in my life, it's always wonderful to be back where students are. So thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. Given that the project on gross domestic knowledge product is yet in its infancy, I would I would not have the sort of ability to talk about it for my given time, half an hour. So what I thought I'll do is to divide this into two, my presentation. One, to tell you as to how the Indian economy is placed today, and why is it important that we emphasize knowledge production and the measurement of knowledge, and then come to the actual project on that Professor Sulpaso and I are trying to do, which is to try and estimate the gross domestic knowledge product in India, and to which FICCI has joined with him to try and do so. So what I'll do is that in the first part, with your permission, Professor Bachela, is that I'll try and tell you just a little bit about India and the Indian economy, the structure to which the Dean has referred to already, and then get on with the GDKP, as it were. And I think quite often, and it's quite inevitable, that when you talk about the Indian economy, you tend to compare it always with this other big giant called the Chinese economy, because those are the two Asian giants whose rise or whose emergence has led to this impression that the center of economic gravity is shifting from the Atlantic basin to Asia or to the Pacific basin, etc. And I think this, and so the two economies are often compared, are often spoken about in the same breath. And my first sort of point is that it is actually not quite fair to mention China and India in the same breath at this point of time, because I think the two countries are quite on their own, in their own league, in their own sphere, and a comparison between the two of them could quite often be misleading because of where we are in our own scale of development, in our own process of development, and in the two countries' process of development. And let me just let me just sort of amplify on that too. I have no hesitation in saying today, as we are, and I just recently gave a talk at the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy, which is where our senior civil servants are sort of trained, where I admitted, and they all agreed, which is that given where we are, India is quite far behind China, in the sense of material, achievements, because, 1978 we were quite together. Our GDP per capita was the same, or if not, India was a little higher. Our GDP sizes were higher. But given that they started their reforms in 1978 and we waited till 1991, the Chinese, GDP, the Chinese GDP per capita, the Chinese share of foreign trade, of the world trade, the Chinese, requirements, shares of the world GDP are much bigger than India. So at the moment, so in some ways, you can say that, the Indian GDP is about a third of the Chinese GDP, and the Chinese have pulled away in the last, from 78 onwards, as nobody else, and nobody had at least sort of, had anticipated. But they have performed one of the biggest miracles in human economic history, which is to grow at an average rate of more than 8.5%, or even 9% for the last 3 decades. And I think this is, we in India recognize this. We in India sort of, look towards China for what they have achieved in terms of their poverty reduction, in terms of their science and technology achievements, and as I said, in terms of their economic achievements, a continuous rate of growth of about 8.5%, 9% for 3 decades, which has meant that China's GDP today is more than 5.6 trillion, 5.4 trillion, while India is at about 1.5 trillion economy. So that's, so I want to place that in the context. But I do, having done that, I must point to a few very crucial differences between India and China, which is that in India, since our independence, we have, for whatever reason and for a very conscious choice, decided to undertake our three transitions, the economic, social, and political, simultaneously. And that was a very audacious undertaking by our forefathers, by our sort of independent, the leaders of our independence movement, who said that we cannot wait and we cannot sequence our transitions, first economic, then social, and then political. We have to do it ourselves because, given our own history, given our complexity, given the diversity of the Indian society, given the openness of the Indian society, given the continental nature of the Indian society, it cannot be a situation where a group of people, a sort of a oligarchy, or if you like, some kind of a benevolent dictatorship can control the people to say that, look, wait for your political and social transitions, first let of the economic transition, and then we will do the rest. But this triple transition in a complex, pluralistic, diverse society like ours has meant that we have paid the costs of economic development up front, and we have not shelved them behind. Which is, we have not sort of kept them in the side. We have paid them up front. This is like a fixed cost of development. So all the fixed costs that we had to incur have been, in terms of the political transition, in terms of the social transitions, have been paid up front. And that, of course, has meant that the rate of growth has been lower, that the rate of growth, economic growth, has been that much less than it could have been. But there was no other way forward for India, given what India is. And therefore, I think this is one crucial difference between us and India and China, which is that in Indian case, whatever has happened, there is a certainty of how it will go forward. There is a certain sort of, you can one be sure that there are not too many, unknowns and uncertainties waiting in the future, which may derail the economic development or the economic growth in China or in India going forward, while this could be the case in some other countries which have postponed their social and political transitions. And I just want to give a couple of examples in India's case, which is that once you look at the social transitions, ours was the most hierarchical, ours was the most sort of, society given by caste and religions and feudal society order, etc. But we were bold enough to say that we will do this all together, as a result of which today you have a person, you have a woman from the lowest of the caste, the Dalit caste, as the chief minister or equivalent to the governor of the largest province in India. I mean, that's the sort of social transition that we've been able to take. In Tamil Nadu, in the south, we know that the Dalit movement, the Dravid movement there has meant that it is the people of those, of the lowest, social strata, which have now been ruling that country for close to four decades. We have had a diversity of our political situation, where we have had communist rule two of our most important states for more than 3 decades, and at the same time we've had the rightists rule in other countries. We've had we have had some of the religious parties, forming coalition governments, etc. And we have adopted the highest form of parliamentary democracy ever since we started in 1947, so that each member of our population has the same adult franchise and the rights to vote. Now, why am I saying all of that? Is that we have therefore been audacious enough to say that we will compromise on our economic growth, on our economic transition, but we need to develop these aspects of our society, because we couldn't take the chance of these aspects, coming to the surface later on, because we don't, so that's, given that, I think, let me pose to you that today's India's growth is like a microcosm of the global economy, because we are as plural, as diverse. We have 18 official languages. We have 2,500 dialects. We have every religion in the world represented in the country, and the freedom to practice that religion. We are open, we are liberalized, and we push, and so that whatever happens in India today in terms of its growth and development, one could say that this is the experiment which the global economy will have to take on itself tomorrow if we want to go forward. And I think that is, in that sense, what is happening in India today is actually salutary in some sense, and demands much greater attention from the rest of us in the world, because otherwise, if you don't do that, the old primeval tendencies of protectionism, of closing your borders, of discriminating between different types of people could come to the fore, which we in India have resisted very successfully over the last 6 decades while undertaking our economic transition and growth. The other big difference between the Indian economic growth and development and some other countries like China is that our growth is not threatening to anybody in any sense. We don't depend upon the external markets to the extent that others have done in terms of achieving our growth. Our net exports in India, net export, that is exports minus imports, contribute a negative 7% to our GDP per annum. A negative, because we are a structurally a trade deficit economy, a current account trade deficit economy, while in cases like China, their net exports contribute a positive 10% to their GDP. So that the growth in some of the Asian economies has meant that the rest of the world has had to make space for that growth in terms of much larger imports, etc., while we in India have contributed to a global balance, which today the G20 has been asking for and been striving for, that you've got to have a much more balanced growth within each country if you want to achieve that. So our growth is much more domestic demand driven than any other growth that you would have seen in the recent 3 or 4 or 5 decades in Asia or anywhere else. Secondly, our growth is also not as focused on achieving strategic dominance in the world as some other growth has been, in the sense of that the share of our budget or of our GDP that goes to strategic development, to our defense, etc., has been comparatively much lower. And we have played by the norms of global commerce and economics and global public goods, where some others have not, so that our growth is not seen as threatening as the others. So that's the other big thing and finally, let me just say, which is to end this thing about to end our come to a completion about how I've seen the Indian economic growth, which is that since the year 2000, our growth has averaged about 8% per annum, which is not bad at all. In per capita terms, that means that we are growing at least about 7% per annum in per capita terms, which means that we'll be able to double our per capita growth in less than 13 years, so less than about 12 years, every 12 years as we go forward, so that some estimates have that by 2050, we would be easily the second largest economy in the world, and our per capita income would be more than the average middle income country level. So there is therefore a huge opportunity and a great prospect for the Indian economy as we are going forward. And the second one that I wanted to say, that if we measure, and I have a slide here which I can show on the iPad that I have borrowed from my wife who's sitting in the audience, which is that I have a slide here which shows that if you measure India's growth and China's growth in terms of reform period, in terms of the number of years since the reform, and therefore if 1978 is T0 for China and 1991 is T0 for India, the trajectory of growth is such that by 2030 or so, we would pass the Chinese growth rate, and we will overtake it, because the Chinese growth rate is beginning to slow down in terms of, and is inevitable, because as their demographics catches up, and as our demographic advantage continues to yield the growth towards us, that about around 2030, the Indian economic growth rate would become higher than China, and there will be therefore a convergence in the rates of growth. But what we have to be careful is that we have to see our performance in terms of the reform years rather than just in terms of chronological years as we go forward. And so that is where I think it is important to think about the strengths that India has, the structural strengths that India has, which China had already. And the first one that comes to mind is, of course, the demographic structure. And this is what I'm going to relate to the knowledge, the GDKP as I go forward. Demographics is that 75% of our population is yet still below 30 years of age. And we will not face the same situation as China does, that China has the prospect today of an economy of a country which could become old before it becomes rich. And that is because of their one-child policy that they followed in the past. Because their demographic window will close in the next 10 years. And that's already beginning to happen as the Chinese wages rise by 14% per annum for the last 3-4 years. And you are beginning to see the movement of some industries and capacities out of China into their neighboring countries and also into India. The other one that is an important one is entrepreneurship, which is that we, we have a huge reservoir and base of entrepreneurship in the country, which relies upon its inherent knowledge and skills to take innovations on a local level much more in their stride than anywhere else. And finally, we have this very rising rate of savings, already high, and rate of savings that will finance this growth as we go forward. Now, the importance of why I wanted to work with Professor Sulpasso on the gross knowledge domestic product is that our demographic dividend that we keep talking about will not be available to us unless we train this huge, unless we increase the knowledge content of our population that we have, unless we convert what I call human wealth into human capital. And the distinction between wealth and capital, human wealth and capital, is the amount of knowledge that you can impart to their resource, to that resource, which is the human resource. And that is why when Professor Sulpasso suggested that we work on this, I immediately kind of responded to that, because I know how important it is to improve the knowledge content of the human capital that we have in India. And therefore, it's also important that we know that we always talk about now the global knowledge economy. We talk about the global competitiveness being based much more on knowledge than any one of the other resources, whether it is land, fossil fuel, or mineral resources. We know that the world GDP is becoming lighter, as it were, rather than heavier, so that the fossil fuel content, the land content, the resource content of the world GDP is becoming less as we are going forward. And that is what India will have to face. And India is not as richly endowed in all of these resources as we would like to be, or as some of our other resources are. And therefore, following the other Asian economies, China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, etc., we know that our comparative advantage will be ultimately in a large body of trained, highly educated, greatly skilled human capital that we have as we go forward. And therefore, it is important for us. And therefore, it is important for us to measure where we are on that scale. Therefore, it is important to measure for us as to what is the gap between what we need and what we have achieved today. Therefore, and I think, and this is what I keep telling my political leaders as often as I can, the demographic dividend, when taken for granted, is the most dangerous thing that you can get. Because demographic dividend, if it is assumed that it is something like manna which falls from heaven, is something that you will never get. And I keep reminding everybody who cares to listen that in Iran, that they had exactly the same demographic structure as we have today in the late 1970s. And then when the Shah of Iran took that demographic dividend for granted, confined his attention only to Tehran and the court around it, and we know what happened to Iran afterwards. And therefore, the demographic dividend can convert itself into a demographic nightmare unless we make the necessary investment that we have to do. Given that background, I think it is important for India it is important for India to not just measure its gross domestic product the way we do at the moment in terms of its material content, which is what we do, but also because, as you, Dean, yourself said, given that India has achieved a different model of growth, which is that even at the lower per capita income of $1,200, $1,300 per capita, the services share, the share of services sector is as much as 57% in our economy. So that our manufacturing share has remained about 16% of the economy. And we have, in some sense, avoided the path of mass manufacturing dependent on external export growth, as the Asian economies have done. So therefore, given that this is the model that is, in a sense, emerged from India, it is not planned for. In India, there is no such thing. But given that our entrepreneurs have seen the comparative advantage in this form of growth, we would need to emphasize the knowledge content. And as a result of which, I think it's a result of which that the government had set up a knowledge commission under Professor Sam Petroda, to try and figure out as to how we will take our higher education in form in the years to come. And then we've also established a National Innovation Council, again under the leadership of Sam Petroda, to find out as to how we will encourage innovativeness in our society and in our economy. And this is why even our President Abdul Kalam Azad has talked repeatedly about creating a greater innovative capability and looking at the local forms of adaptation, which in India we use a word called jugaad to signify that, which is that you just want to use whatever we have to create a possibility, and all of that has to be based on the knowledge content of the gross domestic product. And therefore, I think what we and what Professor Sulpaso and I have set out to do is to try and estimate within the 3 or 4 great producers of the economy, which is the government, the firms, and the households. And the households can then be divided into rural and urban, and the firms can be divided into many other categories, which is, the rural, urban. Among those great producers, how much is being spent on creating the knowledge content in the society? Now, this is not an easy task, because we will have to identify the sources of knowledge. We will have to identify the multipliers of knowledge. We'll have to identify how the knowledge was created and diffused. But nonetheless, if Indian economic policy making has to focus on allocating its resources to those sectors where the knowledge multiplier is the highest, where India can actually derive the greatest advantage by allocating the resources, the finite resources that it has, it will do better in terms of trying to identify those sectors where this knowledge creation has the largest impact on the production of the GDP going forward. And I think this is why what we are trying to do, what we in FICCI will try to do as we go forward with his guidance, is to try and see as to how much of our each sector, of how much of our each subsector this expense is spent on the knowledge creation, and what is the relationship between that knowledge expenditure to the production of the GDP. Now, I know that there are, following the Sarkozy Commission and following the work by Professor Stiglitz, etc., the current form of GDP measurement is known to be passé. We know that we do not want to rely anymore on the gross domestic product in terms of its grossness to measure the achievement of an economy. We know that people are talking about the satisfaction levels, the happiness index. Our neighbors in Bhutan talk very clearly about the sustainable happiness, ecological environment index, etc., etc. All that may well be very useful to depict the, as it were, the consumption side of the prosperity, the consumption side of the economy, in terms of the level of satisfaction or the welfare level of the population. But the ability, the capacity of that population to drive the economy forward in the coming years will necessarily have to be based on the knowledge content of that economy. Now, let me repeat, it's not easy. It's a complex, as the Dean himself said. It will be very difficult to differentiate between different types of knowledge, between trying to find a standard unit of how we will define knowledge. What will that be? But nonetheless, I think it is worth doing in the most simplistic of ways to begin with, at least, to try and capture the knowledge content of a country's GDP. In trying to make it to a proxy of its future global competitiveness as we go forward. Let me just add here a recent thing that I've encountered, which is a work by somebody called Professor Jeremy Rifkin, who's been talking about the third industrial revolution, and who's also been emphasizing that the era of the second industrial revolution, which was based on fossil fuel almost entirely, is beginning to get over. And who is therefore also himself talking about distributed energy production and distributed knowledge production, and the fact that those economies will be able to bring those two together will see their growth and their economic development going much faster ahead than those who will continue to depend upon the mass production of products, energy, and services. So from that mass production, from that era where you wanted to have huge economies of scale as a measure of economic success, is probably going to be behind us very soon. And if that be true, then I think the calculation, the estimation of the gross knowledge domestic product will become even more critical as we go forward. So this is where we are today. This is what our attempt is. I hope in the next 6 months or so, we will be able to produce our first estimate, which will be, of course, very, very simple. But nonetheless, we think at least that will be a small step, the big step in a small way in trying to explain what India's global competitiveness will look like in future. So I have no pretensions of trying to push any frontiers of knowledge forward. My only modest attempt is to try and make sure from the private industry's point of view in India as to how we are going to fare in this global economy, which is going to become much more knowledge intensive as we go forward. And if I am successful in doing that, I'm sure my members, my private sector industry members, would look towards FICCI as having done a reasonable task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.